You might know that preaching students are taught to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. To comfort those who are suffering and to cause pain and discomfort to those who are too comfortable. It has also been said that this is actually how God operates in the world. That God comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable. Those suffering are being comforted, and those who are too comfortable will be upset. Perhaps that is God's will. Perhaps that is God's plan. Is it possible that God's plan, if God has a plan, is that simple? It's interesting to note that originally the quote was used by a columnist in Chicago in 1902. This columnist named Finley Peter Dunn wrote the words of Mr. Dooley. Some of you might know of Mr. Dooley Ooly Ooh, saying that newspapers should comfort the afflicted, journalists of his time, and afflict the comfortable, the powers that be. I'm afraid that we have no problem being afflicted by the media these days. But truth be told, I personally find very little comfort there. So much so that we might want to fast from the news, but we can't, right? Because we are a people who need to know. Karl Barth, noted theologian of the last century, suggested, if not demanded, that preachers preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. A wise suggestion, we can agree, because preaching, right, should speak to the now as well as the then. That makes preachers a little like prophets, right? Biblical prophets definitely afflicted the comfortable. That was their job, to speak against the powers that be who were breaking covenant with God. The prophet Amos was a herdsman and a shepherd, called by God to speak on God's behalf. He's a progressive, radical prophet, most of them are, operating in his context, speaking to his context for the facing of the hour, and warning what God would do. This morning we read the third of 5 visions that Amos saw, predicting grave punishment, execution for the king, exile for the people. God is angry. And as a good and faithful United Methodist Wesleyan theologian, centered in love and grace, that makes me very uncomfortable. The angry God makes me uncomfortable. In his famous book, The God Delusion, you may have heard of it, Richard Dawkins writes that the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Jealous and proud of it, petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, misogynist, homophobe, and racist. Bloodthirsty. God is genocidal, pestilential, and sadomasochist, and a malevolent bully. Yikes. Roman Catholics, some who identify as recovering, may recall being taught more about an angry and punishing God than a God of all mercy and grace. Around 144, a man named Marcion decided to throw out the whole Old Testament. He believed that the wrathful God of the Hebrew Scriptures was a separate and lower entity than the all-forgiving God of the New Testament. Some Christians today cannot be bothered with the Old Testament. And Marcion wasn't alone in that thinking. The Gnostics, too, saw the Creator God of the Old Testament as a lesser power in the world. Thomas Jefferson, well, he just cut out the parts he didn't like. I think we all do that. But I don't want to throw out the Hebrew Bible. I don't want to reject the scriptures that Jesus called his own. I want to understand the role of the prophet and the preacher and the call to the covenant people. I want to understand and live into the pain of God's plan to comfort the afflicted and call truth to power and not become too comfortable. Guilty as charged. I want to be uncomfortable, upset, and even outraged with all that we're seeing in the news. Separated families, homeless asylum seekers, subpar care for our veterans, gun violence in our schools and elsewhere, and the racism that is alive and well throughout the land, etc., etc., etc. Amos sees a plumb line which measures the people's failures. In the midst of Israel, God plants a plumb line. And it's interesting because the writer uses an interesting verb. Now, there are Hebrew scholars in the house, so I'm just going to remind you I am not one of them. But I do, in my studies, get a sense of the language, get a sense of how words can mean very different things in very different contexts, not unlike they can with us today. But this word that God uses when God says, I will not pass them by, means different things in different places. It sounds like a good thing that God will not pass them by, but clearly here, it is not good news. Ebar, to pass them by, is used to mean forgiving, to pass over someone else's transgression. Therefore, in reading this morning, it is a vow by God not to forgive and not to forget how they have broken covenant. It is also used to speak of the peoples passing over God. We too can forget and not forgive and not proclaim where proclamation is needed. We are often overstepping or transgressing God's laws, God's covenant to us, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and then love your neighbor as yourself. And here's the good news. The verb is used in one more place. It appears early on when God appears to Moses. And in those verses, God's passing by is God's drawing near to us. As Moses witnesses God's glory, God's passing by, God's drawing near, it is God's visitation, God's comfort for the afflicted. Come quickly, Lord, recites the liturgy of the early church. And so it seems that maybe even in this text, if we go deeper, we realize that God is both in a place of judgment and yet still very much a part of the lives of the Hebrew people. It seems that God does comfort the afflicted, the lost, and the suffering. And it seems that God does visit and draws near to those who suffer. And for those who get too comfortable, God will not forget what we have done and maybe what we have not done. But isn't it true that we can be both things at once? Isn't it true that we're suffering because we're outraged? Isn't it true that we're looking out in the world and wondering what we can do? Light candles at the detention center, march, write letters, say thank you, please help, and suffer in the action? I think that just as God is both things, both merciful and calling us to justice, caring about the justice, we too are both things. We are the afflicted, some of us more than others, and we are the comfortable, some of us far more than others. I have preached sermons on mornings after 9/11. I have preached sermons on the morning after the Sandy Hook shootings. And I have preached a sermon in a hoodie, the morning after the news of Trayvon Martin. But it seems the world isn't always ready to live out God's plan to comfort the suffering. We are not always ready to live out God's plans of sharing in the suffering. People were upset with me on those days, what I called out. And yet we're all in different places, right? We don't all agree. We are both suffering, and we are also sometimes too comfortable. The world isn't always ready to live out God's plan to comfort the suffering, take part in the suffering, but that is the work of God's people. That is the work of the church. God's people aren't always ready to confront our creature comforts in less than Christ-like ways. But God will awaken the privileged and pardon the perpetrator. God will afflict the comfortable, and God will comfort the afflicted for the facing of this hour and for the living of these days. Oh God, grant us wisdom and courage. It really might be that simple. Amen.